Ladies and gentlemen, it is now time for the Leader's keynote address.
Ladies and gentlemen, please be upstanding for your party leader, Mike Nesbitt, MLA.
Thank you very much indeed. Thank you to Colin. I feel like my work's done already. But there is a speech. It has been 12 months that will bring on big changes. The challenge is to identify opportunities and then to make the most of them. And we accept that challenge. We have moved already to address that challenge, even though others are still on the starting line. Conference, there have been major developments in this party in the last 12 months. The May elections transformed our Assembly group with no fewer than 8 newly elected members. No other party elected more first-time MLAs, and it's clear already that our 2016 group is acting as a team in a way the class of 2011 never could. There is a coherence and a cohesion that I think bodes very well for this mandate. Now, I know you've met them already this morning, but I do want to acknowledge again Steve Aitken, Rosemary Barton, Doug Beattie, Robbie Butler, Alan Chambers, Harold McKee, Jenny Palmer, and Philip Smith. I put on record my thanks to them and to our returning members who have embraced them as colleagues, and I applaud all of them for the way they have bought into the concept of opposition. You know, when I worked at UTV, the standing joke was that Frank Mitchell did 2 laps of Belfast City Hall every lunchtime just to see who recognised him. It's a variation of the old thing. The only thing worse than being talked about is not being talked about. Well, Conference, we needn't worry about people not wanting to talk about us. In fact, let's do that, because earlier this year you allowed me to complete a full cycle of elections as your leader. So it's probably a decent time to review progress and ask the question, how well did we do? Well, 2 years ago, Jim Nicholson retained his seat again in the European Parliament. And given what happened on the 23rd of June, I think everybody should be very glad that he did, because I can tell you there is no British MEP, not one, who commands more respect in the corridors of Brussels than Jim Nicholson. 2014 also saw us record local government results beyond the dreams of most. Comparing like with like between the old 26 council model and the new 11 super councils, we achieved double-digit growth in our numbers. And then last year, we recorded not 1 but 2 successes in the most difficult elections of all, the first past-the-post general election to the House of Commons. And that brings us to this May and to the Assembly elections. You know I wanted better, and I know you did too. But we didn't do anything wrong. We had great candidates, we planned well, we published no fewer than 9 policy documents, not just a manifesto, but a vision for Northern Ireland looking decades ahead, plus detailed action plans on specific areas: mental health, cancer care, animal welfare. We campaigned, in fact, for Northern Ireland's first ever post-sectarian election, where the issue was belief in a party's ability to deliver on the issues that matter: your vote, not saying, support us, or you get one of them. It's not vote Arlene, or you get Martin. And of course, the irony of that is this: when you vote Arlene, you're basically guaranteeing that you get Marty, because politically they're joined at the hip. So maybe next time we can persuade people that if you vote Mike, you get Colm. If you vote Colm, you get Mike. If you vote middle ground, you get better. Well, Colm is here, and I'm very glad he is, and without prejudice to all the issues we may not see eye to eye on, but also recognising our common aim of making Northern Ireland work, I offer you, Colm, a warm, personal, and a heartfelt welcome. And I know Claire Hanna is here as well. It's her patch. She's obviously keeping a close eye on you. Okay. Like the SDLP, we tried for an assembly election focused on bread and butter issues, but we all know from the doorstep that the fear factor remained dominant. I can't tell you how often I heard people tell me, "Oh, I'd love to vote for you, son, but we'll have to keep Marty out." Well, despite that, we left Stormont in March with 13 MLAs. We returned in May with 16. No other of the big parties grew their numbers. So I'm not saying it was the greatest result in the cycle, but in its proper context, it was a very, very solid performance. And in its own way, it did represent growth. And it completed a set of elections we can look back on with some pride and some satisfaction, but not complacency. So to anybody looking to press the panic button, to the very few who have jumped ship, and to the occasional whisperer and malcontent, I say this: are you so weak you want to unravel 4 years of work just because we didn't get all we wanted first time around? Are you so easily led that a siren voice is enough to make you change your mind? I'll tell you what I did after the elections. I dusted myself off, I gave myself a good kick up the backside, and I got on with it. So let's not fall for propaganda from political enemies who understand that a united Ulster Unionist Party outside the executive, free to criticise and to offer alternatives, is a serious threat, especially an Ulster Unionist Party working well with the SDLP. The only thing worse than being talked about is not being talked about. I was at the Freshers' Fair at Queen's University 3 weeks ago. The Young Unionists signed 72 new members. 72. Not for the first time, the YUs are the biggest unionist grouping at the university. That is growth conference. Steady, sustainable growth. And the vision remains the same: a post-sectarian society where people vote on the executive's performance and on the credibility of what the opposition has to offer. We published 9 policy papers from the May elections. Each one has our logo upon it, the words, "Doing what's right for Northern Ireland." Doing what's right for Northern Ireland. Do you know, I heard the First Minister make that very commitment just a couple of weeks ago. You know where? The Conservative Party Conference. After 6 years mercilessly attacking us for our electoral pact with the Tories in 2010, 6 years in bed with Sinn Féin attacking Tory austerity, the DUP sponsored a champagne lunch at the Conservative conference. No austerity there then. And you know, they seemed to think and sense they'd made a bit of a mistake with the champagne lunch, so they tried to say it was champ, not champagne. Well, for the avoidance of doubt, that's champ, that's champagne. You know, my vision is not just for a post-sectarian society. I want a peace process society. Because what is the peace process in 2016? I tell you what I think Sinn Féin think it is. They think it is a weapon. Anytime something inconvenient comes along, Sinn Féin call it a threat to the peace process. It helps to maintain the illusion that we remain in a state of transition, that there's something about our political challenges that need special treatment. It also helps keep the godfathers of the IRA in place on the pretext that there's a peace process that is incomplete and therefore could be endangered without their buy-in. Conference, I think Sinn Féin have milked the peace process for all it's worth, and it is time to move on. Time to end the implicit threat to stability that runs as a dangerous undercurrent through our politics. The peace process for Sinn Féin is nothing more than their weapon of choice for getting their way. Winston Churchill once spoke of a bodyguard of lies, and the peace process is now Sinn Féin's bodyguard. And successive British governments since '98 have been only too willing to sustain this state of affairs, in league with Dublin and with Washington. They've been willing to repeat the mistakes of the past, preferring to placate Republicans rather than uphold the law. You know, the main conclusion of the Royal Commission into the inquiry into the 1916 Easter Rising 100 years ago was just that. The report said, and this is a quote, "It was safer and more expedient to leave law in abeyance if collision with any faction of the Irish people could thereby be avoided." Well, only this month we've heard further examples of money supposedly ring-fenced for community development being filtered through so-called gatekeepers. It's happening on both sides. But it was this party who said, just because you have a past does not mean you cannot have a future. But that future has to be a 180-degree transformation of the past. I'm talking about people who've shown energy and commitment, which they've used in the most awful, illegal, and destructive ways. I believe it's our responsibility to encourage those who still have energy and commitment to use it positively for the benefit of their community. But we must also make clear we will no longer tolerate anybody whose focus is on exercising unwanted control over communities, lining their own pockets, or damaging our international reputation through racketeering and organized crime. If working-class unionist communities had wanted those gatekeepers to represent and lead them, they would have voted for them. The gatekeepers would be sharing the blue benches of the Assembly with us. But they didn't and they're not, although they may have proxies in one of the biggest parties. So it's high time we delivered an unambiguous message. If you want to work positively, we will help you. But if you do not, there will be consequences. And that is what has been missing over the last 18 years: sanctions. I have little confidence in the arrangements in the so-called Fresh Start Agreement. We don't want annual reports on progress towards the disbandment of paramilitary groups. We want disbandment today, with sanctions for non-compliance. It is a big ask, but nobody said delivering good government was easy, especially if you stray from your principles. I want a government that spends taxes wisely, protects its citizens, cares for the vulnerable, and punishes the guilty. A government that's fair, open, and transparent in its actions. And in return, I want citizens who aspire to be self-reliant, to take responsibility, work hard, pay their taxes, plan for the future, help their neighbours, and help the needy. And in a properly post-sectarian society, things would be different. There would be a focus on the track record of our executive and its ministers. Now, I know it's not the done thing to criticise our First Minister, but take a look at her record. As the chairman said earlier, as Environment Minister, Arlene Foster allowed the new Super Council boundaries to be drawn up in a way that now has her colleagues jumping up and down with anger. Then, as our Enterprise Minister, Mrs. Foster presided over the scandal that is the renewable heat incentive, a scheme so badly mismanaged, it's going to cost over £1 billion sterling. And you and I and our children will pay for it out of the block grant for the next 20 years. And from the economy, it was finance at a time the public were rightly seeking an explanation for the NAMA scandal that has seen our international reputation dragged through the gutter as tens of thousands of pounds are handed over in hospital car parks. And that is only scratching the surface, Conference. And then, in search of a vote 5 months ago, the First Minister scaremongered on the doorstep. Scaremongered over the dangers of Sinn Féin, only to return to Stormont to vote for a Sinn Féin Principal Deputy Speaker, collaborate with Sinn Féin over the appointment of a Justice Minister, and collude with Martin McGuinness to use the royal prerogative to appoint a spin doctor. And on it goes. But think about it, Conference. The DUP supported Martin McGuinness, a self-styled, proud and principled Republican, to take unto himself the powers of a monarch, King Marty, to avoid a public appointment process. Of course, Arlene Foster also conferred those regal powers upon herself. A far cry, I would suggest, from her promise to hold rogue and renegade ministers to account. Holding ministers to account is our job, the official opposition, the first since 1972. And I want to put on record how proud I am of my MLA colleagues for the way they came to the decision. We fought the Assembly election seeking a mandate to enter the negotiations that were supposed to follow on from the elections. 2 weeks for the parties entitled to be in government, and here I quote paragraph 61 of the Fresh Start Agreement, to resolve the draft programme for government. You know we had two tests. We wanted to know, was it a progressive plan? And did we sense a determination for once from the DUP and Sinn Féin to work collaboratively with their partners in government to deliver it? They failed both tests on day one. As we speak, that draft isn't even published yet, and the final document may well emerge between Christmas and the New Year, when the Assembly is in recess and you're not paying attention. Talk about a good time to publish bad news. But I am proud our MLAs were unanimous in the decision. We met twice that day. The first time we debated the pros and cons of opposition, and I made clear opposition can be an exposed and a lonely place. I suggested it could make for a long 5-year mandate. And I also asked them to think about what would happen if, miracle of miracles, the DUP and Sinn Féin actually got their act together, and how that would play in 2021 when we next seek a vote from the electorate. And I asked them to go away to reflect. They came back unanimous. Doing what's right for Northern Ireland is not an empty phrase in this party. The phrase is not just warm words. It represents a set of values that are ingrained in Ulster Unionism. Country first, party second, individual third. So as a responsible opposition, we will do two things. Firstly, we will scrutinise the work of the executive. And let me again emphasise, scrutiny is not synonymous with criticism. Scrutiny means taking a close look at the words and the deeds of the DUP Sinn Féin government, and if at the end of that scrutiny we think the executive has done a good job, we will say so. Low flying pigs withstanding. The other function is that of offering an alternative to executive policy. And I would like to say, like our document, Our Vision for Northern Ireland Outside the European Union, but of course you can't offer an alternative to nothing. And to date, the executive have offered us nothing on Brexit. No vision, no plan, no list of priorities. Meanwhile, the UK government has reconfigured itself to create a whole department with the Secretary of State for exiting the European Union. The Secretary of State for Northern Ireland has a business advisory group. The Scottish Government has an advisory panel, and so do we, the Ulster Unionist Party. And I thank the participants who represent the private sector, manufacturing, agriculture and agri-food processing, the universities, the community and voluntary sector, the trade unions. In short, all the people, the groups and the sectors who will be most affected by Brexit whenever it happens. You know, nobody doubts Northern Ireland will be the most affected nation or region in the whole of the United Kingdom by withdrawal from the EU, yet extraordinarily, we are still the least prepared because of the paralysis of our DUP Sinn Féin government. For us, the days of Remainers and Brexiteers are over. Now, I know Colin and many others take a different view, and we have to respect that without necessarily supporting the position. For us, the people voted. The result is the result, and we must now plan for the UK's withdrawal from the EU and do so in a manner that will maximise opportunities for all the people of Northern Ireland, for Unionists, for Nationalists, for others. We recognise the need to ensure, as they're doing in London, in Edinburgh, in Cardiff and in Dublin, that we have the intellectual capacity and the backup resources in the right place to monitor live, as it happens, the twists and turns of the negotiations. We understand the need to scope this out, to identify the policy options, to choose the priorities, and critically, to assess whether our priorities complement or clash with the UK government's, because where there are clashes, we have a massive problem. We also need to know what we want out of the negotiations, and we've identified 10 key asks. Now, some come at no cost, others will require hard-nosed negotiation with the UK government, not least our calls for a step change in skills and education, and a massive increase in investment in infrastructure. Why pick those areas? Because we are fed up with a devolved government that thinks dependency is a good thing. Every time there's a problem, out comes the DUP Sinn Féin begging bowl, and it's off to London or to Dublin or to both. But if you cherish Northern Ireland, as I do, then you'll fight tooth and nail for the tools to make us less dependent on others. You'll argue for the infrastructure that represents a set of economic accelerators that will generate serious wealth for our people. Transport, communications, energy. Above all, energy conference. Not just the cost of energy, which puts us near the top of the league table of the most expensive in Western Europe, but security of supply. There has been a shocking failure to address the need for an energy strategy over the last 9.5 years, and I'm afraid that also falls at the feet of our current First Minister, who spent many years at the Department of Enterprise, Trade and Investment. If we do not act soon, we can look forward to sections of our population celebrating Northern Ireland's centenary by candlelight. We are already paying power stations to generate electricity we do not use because of the fear of failure in the supply chain. So, scrutiny and an alternative, those are the key functions of opposition at Stormont. And we have plenty of ideas conference, ending our status as the fuel poverty capital of the UK, a social value act to recognise the importance of the third sector, transforming the scope of GPs within the National Health Service, and in the wake of the NAMA scandal, regulation of the relationship between lobbyists and executive ministers, as they already do in London and in Dublin. Forming an opposition is entirely consistent with who we are, a party ready and willing to do what's right for the country, whatever the consequences for ourselves. I believe it has been a bold step, but a necessary one, for those of us who seek normal democratic politics in Northern Ireland. What we did in '98 was fit for the times, encouraging everybody into the political tent and away from violence. The last thing we needed then was an opposition, as we tried to create the environment where everybody worked together for the common good. But we're in a very different place today. We've achieved inclusive political frameworks. What we need now is a political system that actually delivers, and opposition will be the key to that. The First Minister welcomed it at the Conservative conference earlier this month. It will make us up our game, she said. No sign of them upping anything yet, but it's good to know Marlene are looking over their shoulder. It's been welcomed. Excuse me. It has been welcomed by the head of the Northern Ireland Civil Service, Sir Malcolm McKibben, and the Prime Minister, Theresa May, has welcomed the formation of the opposition. She wrote to me a few days ago, expressing a welcome for the fact, and I quote, "The institutions have evolved to accommodate an official opposition at Stormont." and I look forward to pursuing that conversation with Mrs. May next month. Of course, if the opposition is going to offer an alternative to the current executive, we need to convince the electorate that we are a viable replacement for the current DUP Sinn Féin government. And that does mean working in partnership with the SDLP, and once again, I welcome the appearance of their leader. And conference, you will recall this is not the first time we've invited a senior member of the SDLP to speak to us. But I wouldn't hold your breath for the two parties of government catching up. But remember, vote me, you get Colm, vote Colm, you get me. Vote Colm and me, you get a whole new middle ground politics dedicated to making Northern Ireland work, whatever our motivations. As Colm said, we don't agree on everything, but can we find a way of doing business together? Absolutely. It's early days for the opposition, but behind the scenes I believe we're working well, and I look forward to better times ahead. Who knows? Maybe a shadow executive promoting policies that actually address and solve problems in a post-sectarian, post-peace process era for Northern Ireland. You know, the day after the referendum, the EU referendum, I met a couple of SDLP voting businessmen. They were shell-shocked, and they were angry at the Brexit vote. Because for years they'd been happy living in a Northern Ireland that was part of the United Kingdom. Their todays were about making money, educating their children, getting granny to the doctor. A united Ireland, that was for tomorrow, some vague time in the future. Brexit has rattled them. Because the Belfast Agreement in '98 guaranteed the consent principle. And they never saw that being breached by a UK-wide vote to exit the European Union. Now, I have said that the days of Remainers and Brexiteers are over, but we must move on in a way that is mindful and respectful of the impact on our nationalist brothers and sisters. Conference, I don't believe identity can any longer be defined in the narrow binary terms of unionist and nationalist, of orange or green, Protestant or Catholic. The Belfast Agreement made arrangements to respect complexity. And we must honour that commitment and respect the fact that there will be new norms as we build a new Northern Ireland, one we can all take pride in. This year has seen the 100th anniversary of the Easter Rebellion, and the Ulster Unionist Party hosted a successful meeting in Dublin in April, making our contribution to understanding that very historical and momentous event. It may have been the first time since the 1920s, since a Unionist Party organised an event in the Republic's capital. By contrast, Sinn Féin used 1916 as a recruiting sergeant. They formulated a slogan which invited people to join the rising. Now, these are words that are designed not just to interpret the past, but to visualise the present and imagine the future. In reality, the events in Dublin that took place 100 years ago were led by a minority of a minority, but this year, nationalists like Colm reclaimed 1916 from that minority. And meanwhile, we remember that over 200,000 Irishmen were fighting to prevent Germany from subjugating a number of European states, including Britain. So let us remember, as we did earlier, the service and sacrifice of the 36th Ulster Division at the Somme. But let us also remember the service and sacrifice of the 16th Irish Division, as I do each year at Gilmore, a short distance from Thiepval and the Ulster Tower. Let us remember we have a shared past as we struggle to define and build a shared future. And let me repeat my call that all school children should be given the opportunity to visit the battlefields in France to observe our shared history. Meanwhile, conference answers on how to deal with our recent past still prove beyond the reach of the executive. And as a former victims commissioner, I feel I have some understanding of the issues from a victim's viewpoint. And as a citizen of the country, I also sense the way the lack of agreement infects our ability to build. And therein lie two unanswered questions. What do we mean by dealing with the past? And for whose benefit do we want to take action? Politicians tend to answer the first question in the narrow terms of seeking truth, acknowledgement, and maybe justice. But the legacy of the past is much broader than that. The severely injured from the 70s and 80s never had a chance to work and contribute to their pension. So there's a compelling case to fix that problem. And you know my view that the biggest and most toxic legacy is poor mental health and well-being. Not just the victims anymore, but their children, their grandchildren, and now their great-grandchildren. And my question is this: why wait until everything is agreed before moving to fix the problems that we already agree on? The other question is a bit more difficult. For whose benefit do we want to deal with the past? Is it for those most affected? If it is, we'll continue to look at the troubles incident by incident, knowing some will get a lot of truth and some will get none. And nobody argues differently. It is a lottery. We can continue to litigate the past, but it becomes a game of chance. It is random and therefore, in isolation, potentially reckless. If we want to do something that allows society to move forward, we need more than just new institutions that focus on justice and on information recovery. We need political courage. The sort of courage Her Majesty the Queen demonstrated on her state visit to the Republic of Ireland when she made an acknowledgement statement speaking of things we could wish had been done differently or not at all. Well, the Ulster Unionist Party governed Northern Ireland from 1921 to 1972, half a century, which ended under intolerable pressure, not just from the civil rights movement, which wanted to transform Northern Ireland, but from violent Republicans who wanted to destroy it in the same spirit as all the other international terrorist organizations of that time. I believe what we must think about is a series of acknowledgement statements from governments and parties. I speak to many victims and survivors, and they would welcome some high-end thinking on the past. The bottom line is this: people made choices. Republicans cannot justify their terrorism by blaming others. It is perverse to argue that somebody forced them to pick up a gun or a bomb. They made that choice. And if Martin McGuinness was prepared to make such an acknowledgement statement, he might be surprised by the responses that could follow from the British government, from Dublin, from Washington, and from local political parties. This is not just about some sort of shallow apology. It is about acknowledging our past, our choices, and their impact, often still felt today. I believe that could transform how we deal with the past. But will it happen? Will Martin McGuinness stop the nonsense of claiming circumstances forced Republicans to take up the bomb and the bullet? Will he admit it was a choice freely made and acknowledge the legacy of that choice continues to poison community relations? I do not believe anybody needed to die to get where we are today. Is he prepared to admit that he chose differently rather than maintaining we left him no choice? Sir Edward Carson warned us in 1920 in a quote in the Commons which I used in my first ever conference speech, and I want to repeat it today because it remains valid. He said, "If Ulster sets up an example and a precedent of good government, fair government, honest government, and has a government not for sections or factions, but for all, her example may be followed and may bring about peace." I think collectively we need to examine that statement and what we need to do to bring it to fruition. Mr. Chairman, before my closing thought, there are three people I would like to mention, all female, as it happens, and two Mrs. Nesbitts. Mrs. Nesbitt Sr. is my mother. Most of us believe we have the best mum in the world. On this occasion, I'm right, you're wrong. I would not have achieved anything in my life without the unconditional love of my mother. So can I just take this opportunity to say, thank you, Mum. The other Mrs. N is my wife, also known as Linda Bryans, and I'm picking up the look Linda gives me when she says, "You didn't tell me you were going to do this," with a little hint of move on, and also a very clear bouquet of "you're sleeping in the spare room if you don't shut up." Being married to a politician requires endless patience. And you know what they say, behind every successful man, there's a very surprised woman. But in this case, also an inspirational one. Thank you, Linda. Now, the third woman is our president. And I know what you're thinking, we don't have a president. And indeed you're right, but we will in a minute. We have three honorary vice presidents in Leslie Cree, Sam Gardner, and in Michael McGimsey. And now it's time for the president. So what are the characteristics of a good president? A lifetime service to the party, loyalty, determination in the face of adversity. Well, actually, we can all write that script, and we are blessed to have many, many, many members who would qualify for consideration on those criteria. But our president has something extra. If she thinks I'm doing well, and by the way, she's not afraid to tell me when she disagrees with what I'm at, but if she does give me the green light, she gives me strength, she gives me confidence, and she gives me courage. So in return, I would just like to give her a small thank you, an honorary role, to add to the many, many titles she's held in this party, a party she joined in the 1950s and has served without break ever since. So conference, this is the point where I ask you to join me in acknowledging our new president from Browns Bay in the constituency of East Antrim, May Steele. PJ, will you help hold the gentleman, please? Thank you very much, conference. You know, when Margaret Ritchie of the SDLP spoke to us a few years ago, she used a familiar phrase to close her remarks. I think she wanted to send out a signal to the big parties that the SDLP, and indeed ourselves, would not be bullied. And I think that's a sentiment probably worth repeating today to the DUP and Sinn Féin. The SDLP and the Ulster Unionist Party will not be pushovers, will not be pushed around in the opposition. And as Margaret so neatly summed it up in her last two words to conference, as she said, I say, no surrender.